The attic of the old Thornton house in rural Massachusetts had remained largely untouched for decades, a time capsule of family history sealed away beneath layers of dust and forgotten memories. In the summer of 2025, Emily Thornton, a 32-year-old librarian from Boston with a passion for historical research, inherited the sprawling Victorian home from her grandmother Rose. The camera follows Emily as she methodically sorts through generations of accumulated belongings, her careful hands opening boxes that hadn't seen daylight in years. "I wasn't looking for anything specific," Emily explains in her interview, as we see her lifting the lid of a weathered cardboard container labeled Family, 1900-1920, in faded ink. "I was simply trying to organize what was worth keeping and what could be donated." Inside, nestled among dozens of sepia-toned photographs of stern-faced ancestors and long-forgotten family gatherings, one particular image catches her attention. Dated July 18, 1915, it shows a family picnic beside a lake. A man in his 40s wearing a boater hat and summer suit, a woman in a long white dress with a high collar, two teenage boys in matching outfits, and a small girl of about 5 in a pinafore dress, her hair in ringlets. The camera slowly zooms in on the image as Emily notices something unusual. Behind the little girl, partially obscured by the trees at the edge of the frame, is a distinct shadow that doesn't align with any visible figure in the photograph. Unlike the natural shadows cast by the picnickers in the bright summer sun, this one appears deliberately placed, darker, more defined, and falling at an angle inconsistent with the lighting in the rest of the image. "At first, I thought it might be a flaw in the development," Emily recalls. "Old photographs often have imperfections, but it was too deliberate, too shaped like a person." When Emily turns the photograph over, the camera captures her expression changing as she reads the faded pencil inscription, "Family picnic at Whitewater Lake. The day Elizabeth disappeared." The words hang in the air as Emily confirms, "The name Elizabeth had never appeared in any family stories passed down to me. It was as if this child had been completely erased from our history." The Millfield Historical Society occupies a converted Victorian home on Maple Street, its rooms filled with artifacts chronicling the town's evolution from a colonial settlement to a modern community. Robert Jenkins, the town's 68-year-old historian with 4 decades of experience documenting local history, sits at an antique desk beneath portraits of Millfield's founding families. His hands, spotted with age but steady with practice, carefully examine the photograph under specialized lighting as Emily watches anxiously. "The preservation quality is remarkable," Jenkins notes, his magnifying glass moving methodically across the image. "Many photographs from this period have degraded significantly, but someone took exceptional care of this one." He identifies each figure with confidence born of years studying the town's genealogical records. This would be Charles Thornton, a prominent banker in Millfield at the time. His wife Margaret, known for her charity work with the local orphanage. Their sons William and James, who would have been about 16 and 14. His finger hovers over the small girl. "And this would be Elizabeth Thornton." The camera pans across the Society's archive room, where Jenkins retrieves several bound volumes of local newspapers. Yellowed pages from the Millfield Gazette, dated July 19, 1915, bear the headline, "Local Child Vanishes During Family Outing." Smaller headlines follow throughout the subsequent weeks. Search parties find no trace of missing Thornton girl. Bloodhounds lose scent at Lake Edge. Hope fades as Thornton search enters 3rd week. The disappearance of Elizabeth Thornton became one of Millfield's most notorious unsolved cases, Jenkins explains, as historical footage shows period-dressed searchers combing through wooded areas. It happened during what should have been a perfect summer day. The family had finished their picnic lunch when Elizabeth asked to collect wildflowers. Her mother allowed her to explore within sight of their blanket. When Margaret looked up just minutes later, the child had vanished completely. When asked about the unusual shadow, Jenkins adjusts his glasses and studies the photograph more intensely. "In all my years researching this case, I've never noticed this anomaly," he admits, his expression troubled. "The Thornton disappearance generated hundreds of pages of documentation, but this shadow appears in none of the official photographic evidence I've catalogued." He looks up at Emily. "It appears deliberately placed, almost as if someone was documenting that they were watching the family. This photograph may be the most significant new evidence in this case in over a century." The county archives reside in the basement of the Millfield Courthouse, a climate-controlled repository containing thousands of documents dating back to the town's founding in 1732. The camera follows Emily as she navigates through shelves of bound records and acid-free boxes, guided by Marjorie Wilson, the county archivist who has maintained these records for over 30 years. They eventually settle at a wooden table illuminated by conservation-appropriate lighting, where Marjorie has assembled all available documentation related to the Thornton case. "The investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance was remarkably thorough for the era," Marjorie explains, carefully opening a folder containing the original police reports. "Sheriff Thomas Blackwell was known for his methodical approach. He employed every resource available, bloodhounds from the state police, volunteer search parties organized by Quadrant, even bringing in a detective from Boston who had experience with missing persons cases." The camera zooms in on Charles Thornton's official statement, the fountain pen ink still vibrant against the aged paper. The document reveals details absent from newspaper accounts. Charles had noticed a tall man in a dark coat, despite the summer heat, watching their picnic from the tree line earlier that day. When asked to elaborate, Charles described the man as well-dressed with a distinctive beard, carrying what appeared to be a camera case. Police records show that despite questioning every resident within a 5-mile radius, no one matching this description was ever identified. What's particularly unusual about this case, Marjorie continues, retrieving another folder, is the longevity of the official investigation. Missing persons cases from this era typically concluded quickly, but the Thornton investigation remained active for nearly 3 years. She presents a file containing correspondence between Margaret Thornton and Sheriff Blackwell, dozens of increasingly desperate letters from a mother unwilling to accept her child's disappearance. The camera focuses on a letter dated October 1917, the handwriting becoming more erratic than in earlier correspondence. I still feel she's alive somewhere. A mother knows these things. I see her in my dreams, calling for me. She is with the man who watched us, the man Charles saw. Please don't abandon my Elizabeth. Emily's voice breaks the silence. She never accepted that Elizabeth was gone. And now we have photographic evidence someone was indeed watching them. Evidence that appears to have been deliberately preserved and annotated, perhaps by Margaret herself. Oakwood Cemetery stretches across rolling hills on the outskirts of Millfield, the final resting place for generations of townsfolk dating back to the Revolutionary War. The camera follows Emily through rows of weathered headstones and ornate family mausoleums until she reaches the Thornton family plot, marked by a marble obelisk inscribed with the family name. Individual monuments stand for Charles Thornton, 1872-1931, and Margaret Thornton, 1875-1922, along with their sons William and James, who lived into the 1970s. At the center of the family plot stands a small angel statue, its features softened by decades of exposure to the elements. The inscription reads, Elizabeth Thornton, 1910-1915, forever in our hearts. Unlike the other graves, no casket lies beneath this monument. They never recovered a body, explains Helen Walsh, a 93-year-old lifelong Millfield resident whose grandmother was Margaret Thornton's closest friend. The camera captures Helen's weathered hands as she places a small bouquet of forget-me-nots near the angel statue. But after a year, the town pressured the family to hold a memorial service. People needed closure, needed to move on with their lives, everyone except Margaret. Archival footage shows the memorial service held in July 1916, exactly 1 year after the disappearance. The Thornton family stands beside an empty casket, Charles stoic and straight-backed, supporting a visibly distraught Margaret. The teenage boys appear uncomfortable in their formal attire, while other townsfolk maintain a respectful distance. According to my grandmother's diaries, Margaret never accepted Elizabeth's death, Helen continues, opening a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous handwriting. Margaret began seeing Elizabeth everywhere, in crowds, through shop windows, and passing carriages. She would chase after strange children, convinced they were her daughter. Charles tried to help her through her grief, but her behavior became increasingly erratic. Helen turns to a later entry in her grandmother's diary. Margaret confided today that she believes Elizabeth was taken, not lost, or drowned as everyone assumes. She speaks of a man who had been watching them for weeks before the picnic. Charles dismisses her claims as delusions of a grieving mother, but I wonder if there might be truth to her suspicions. The camera lingers on Margaret's gravestone, which bears a different date of death than the nearby asylum records would later reveal. Charles eventually had her committed to Westbrook Sanatorium in 1918, Helen says softly. The family told everyone she had gone to stay with relatives in Europe. She died there 4 years later, still insisting her daughter was alive, still crying out for a child who never came home. In a state-of-the-art laboratory at Boston University's Forensic Sciences Department, Professor Miranda Kelly, a leading expert in historical photographic analysis, examines high-resolution digital scans of the picnic photograph. Multiple computer monitors displayed different aspects of the image: light patterns, density measurements, and comparative analyses against known photographic techniques of the early 20th century. What we're seeing here is highly unusual, Professor Kelly explains, directing attention to a three-dimensional rendering of how light falls across the photograph. The family's shadows fall consistently to the right, at approximately a 45-degree angle, which matches the sun's position in mid-afternoon during July in this region, but this figure's shadow behind Elizabeth falls straight down, defying the natural light physics of the scene. The camera moves between the original photograph and computer-generated models, demonstrating how shadows should appear based on the sun's position at Whitewater Lake on a July afternoon in 1915. The discrepancy is unmistakable. Furthermore, the edge definition of this shadow is too sharp for a natural occurrence, continues Professor Kelly, zooming in to show the pixel-level analysis. Natural shadows in photographs from this period typically show some degree of penumbra, a gradual transition from light to dark. The shadow has an unnatural crispness to its edges that suggests darkroom manipulation. A demonstration follows, showing how early photographers could create such effects using blocking techniques during the development process. This required considerable skill, Professor Kelly notes. Whoever added this element had extensive knowledge of photographic development processes and access to a professional darkroom. The analysis continues with a density comparison that reveals another anomaly. The shadow's density is consistent throughout, unlike natural shadows, which vary based on distance from the object. This is further evidence of intentional manipulation. Professor Kelly's conclusion is definitive. With absolute certainty, I can state this shadow was deliberately added to the photograph through darkroom techniques available in 1915. What makes this particularly interesting is the location of the manipulation directly behind the child who disappeared that very day. This wasn't random or accidental. Someone with considerable photographic skill wanted this element to be noticed, possibly as a message, a warning, or signature. And given what we now know about the case, this manipulation may well be the most significant clue to what happened to Elizabeth Thornton. The Thornton family Bible, its leather binding cracked with age and its brass clasps tarnished by time, rests on a conservation table in the Millfield Historical Society. Emily carefully opens it, wearing cotton gloves to protect the delicate pages from oils that could accelerate deterioration. The camera documents her methodical examination of the family record pages, where generations of births, marriages, and deaths are recorded in different handwritings, a tangible genealogy of the Thornton lineage. Family Bibles often contain the most authentic records of family history, explains genealogist Dr. Sarah Montgomery, who has joined Emily's investigation. Before standardized vital records became common, these entries were considered official documentation. More importantly, they can reveal information that government documents might miss, or that families might have chosen to keep private. The entry for Elizabeth Rose Thornton shows her birth on May 3, 1910, written in Margaret's elegant script. Unlike other entries marked with death dates, Elizabeth's remains conspicuously blank, suggesting the family, or at least whoever maintained the Bible after her disappearance, never fully accepted her fate. This absence speaks volumes, Dr. Montgomery notes. Even though a memorial service was held and a headstone erected, whoever kept this record couldn't bring themselves to write an end date for Elizabeth's life. More startling is a subsequent entry dated June 8, 1916, nearly a year after Elizabeth's disappearance. Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, welcome to our family. The handwriting is Charles, not Margaret's, a fact that Dr. Montgomery finds significant. By this point, Margaret was likely already refusing to acknowledge this new child as a replacement for Elizabeth. The camera follows Emily's discovery of a small envelope tucked between the Bible's pages. Inside lies a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Millfield Gazette, announcing the Thorntons' adoption of a 5-year-old orphan whose parents had purportedly died in a train accident. The accompanying photograph shows Charles, William, and James with their new daughter, a girl bearing a striking resemblance to Elizabeth, down to the ringlet curls and wide eyes. The physical similarity is remarkable, Dr. Montgomery observes. It wasn't uncommon for grieving families to seek replacements for lost children, a practice psychologists would strongly discourage today. But the resemblance here is so pronounced it raises questions about whether this was coincidence or something more deliberate, perhaps even an attempt by Charles to provide Margaret with a substitute that might ease her deteriorating mental state. A final discovery comes from the Bible's back pages, where a faded receipt has been preserved. Dated May 1916, it records a substantial payment from Charles Thornton to the saint, Mary's Orphanage in Boston, an amount far exceeding standard adoption fees of the era. This suggests there may have been something unusual about this particular adoption, Dr. Montgomery notes, something that required additional compensation or discretion. The abandoned Westbrook Sanatorium stands on a wooded hillside 20 miles outside Millfield, its brick facade crumbling and its windows broken after decades of neglect. The documentary includes drone footage of the imposing structure, once considered a state-of-the-art facility for treating nervous disorders and female hysteria, diagnoses often applied to women whose behavior deviated from social norms. Archival footage shows the institution in its operational years, patients in white gowns being led through manicured gardens, attendants in starched uniforms, and doctors administering the cutting-edge treatments of the era, including hydrotherapy and early electroconvulsive therapy. While the building itself is now inaccessible, Margaret Thornton's medical records have been preserved at the State Medical Historical Archives. The camera documents Emily reviewing these files under the supervision of Dr. James Pearson, a medical historian specializing in early psychiatric practices. Margaret Thornton was admitted on November 12, 1918, with what they then diagnosed as severe melancholia, persistent delusions. Dr. Pearson reads from the original admission documents. By today's standards, she was likely suffering from complicated grief, possibly post-traumatic stress disorder, and potentially a form of psychosis triggered by the traumatic loss of her child. The attending physician's intake evaluation describes Margaret as physically weakened from self-neglect and refusal of food, with fixed delusional beliefs regarding her missing daughter. Most revealing are the subsequent treatment notes, which document a consistent pattern. Patient insists daughter Sarah is not her real daughter but an imposter, claims someone took Elizabeth and left this changeling in her place, becomes agitated and occasionally violent when husband and sons visit with Sarah, whom she refuses to acknowledge. Later entries document Margaret's deterioration under the institution's treatments, which included extended ice baths, sedation, and isolation. Despite these interventions, or perhaps because of them, her condition worsened. Nurses noted her habit of repeatedly scratching the same phrase on walls, furniture, and even her own arms. The man in the shadows knows. The most revealing document comes from late in Margaret's confinement. A nurse's note from January 1922, just weeks before Margaret's death from pneumonia. Patient briefly lucid this morning. When shown family photograph, the picnic scene her husband provided for comfort, patient became agitated, pointing to the shadow visible behind daughter Elizabeth. Stated clearly, "I added the shadow so someone would know to look. He took her, the photographer. He took my Elizabeth and gave us another child to silence us." Patient refused further food after this episode. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Pearson remarks. If accurate, this suggests Margaret herself altered the photograph as a form of evidence or testimony, a final attempt to document what she believed happened to her daughter, at a time when no one would believe her claims. Historical records reveal that most of Millfield's family portraits and community events during the early 1900s were documented by Theodore Blackwood, owner and sole operator of Blackwood Photography Studio from 1905 to late 1915. The camera pans across examples of his work displayed in the Millfield Historical Society, wedding portraits, family gatherings, school photographs, and civic events, all bearing his distinctive studio stamp, Blackwood Photography, memories preserved for posterity. Blackwood was considered something of an artistic genius locally, explains Victoria Simmons, an art historian specializing in early American photography. His technical precision and artistic composition were remarkable for a small-town photographer. Prior to settling in Millfield, he had apparently studied advanced photographic techniques in Europe, though we found no record of which institutions he attended. The documentary presents a rare portrait of Blackwood himself, a tall, bearded man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit despite the summer setting, standing beside his large format camera. This is the only known photograph of Blackwood, Simmons notes. Like many photographers of the era, he preferred to remain behind the camera rather than in front of it. County business records indicate Blackwood was well established in the community, photographing all prominent families and maintaining a successful studio on Millfield's main street. His client book, preserved in the Historical Society, shows regular appointments with the town's elite families, including multiple sessions with the Thorntons between 1910 and 1915. Most significantly, land and business records show that Blackwood left Millfield abruptly in December 1915, just 5 months after Elizabeth's disappearance. He sold his studio equipment and property within a week, accepting considerably less than market value for both. No forwarding address was recorded, and he left no indication of his destination. What makes his departure particularly suspicious, Emily explains while examining these records, is not just the timing, but the complete severance from a business he had spent a decade building. It's as if he wanted to disappear completely. The investigation uncovers a police report buried in the archives. A neighbor had reported seeing Elizabeth Thornton entering Blackwood's studio the week before the picnic, accompanied by her mother for what was presumably a routine portrait session. The report was filed retrospectively after Elizabeth's disappearance, but appears to have generated no follow-up investigation. Most telling is a bank record Emily discovers through court-ordered access to historical financial documents. Charles Thornton made a substantial withdrawal, equivalent to nearly $50,000 in today's currency, on June 7, 1916, the day before the family announced their adoption of Sarah Elizabeth. The question becomes, the narrator intones as the camera pans across these documents, was this payment for a replacement child? And if so, was Blackwood the broker of this arrangement, or something far more sinister? The investigation widens as Emily collaborates with researchers across multiple states to trace Theodore Blackwood's history before his arrival in Millfield. The camera shows a large map displayed on the wall of Emily's research room, with red pins marking Blackwood's confirmed locations between 1897 and 1905. Cedar Falls, Iowa, Appleton, Wisconsin, Greenfield, Indiana, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and finally, Millfield, Massachusetts. In each location, we discovered a disturbingly similar pattern, explains retired Detective Michael Grayson, who volunteered his expertise to the investigation after learning about it through a true crime podcast covering Emily's research. Blackwood would establish himself as the town photographer, quickly gaining the trust of prominent families through his exceptional technical skills and charming demeanor. He typically remained in each community for approximately 3 years. Newspaper archives from these communities reveal nearly identical stories. In each town during Blackwood's residence, a young girl between 4 and 6 years old disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In each case, extensive searches yielded no results, no bodies were ever recovered, and the cases eventually went cold. Most significantly, in 3 of the 5 locations, the family of the missing child eventually adopted another girl of similar age and appearance. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is essentially 0, states Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a criminal psychologist reviewing the evidence. We're looking at a calculated pattern of behavior spanning nearly 2 decades. Most damning is a photograph Emily discovers in the National Archives, a group portrait of students at the exclusive Barrington School for Girls in Philadelphia from 1920. Among the students is a teenage girl identified in the caption as Eliza Blackwood, daughter of photography instructor Theodore Blackwood. The camera zooms in on her face, then dissolves to the 1915 picnic photograph of Elizabeth Thornton, highlighting the striking similarities in their features. Facial recognition software confirms what the human eye suggests. We're looking at a 97% probability match, explains forensic analyst James Chen. Accounting for age progression and the technical limitations of early photography, this is virtually conclusive. Employment records from the Barrington School show Theodore Blackwood served as their photography instructor and yearbook coordinator from 1916 to 1922, after which he resigned his position citing health concerns. School records indicate Eliza left the institution at the same time, though no graduation certificate was issued. We believe Theodore Blackwood was systematically abducting children, Detective Grayson states as the evidence timeline is displayed. Then, in some twisted way, providing substitutes to the grieving families, likely children orphaned by the numerous influenza outbreaks or industrial accidents of the era. The altered picnic photograph, with its deliberate shadow, now appears to be Margaret Thornton's desperate attempt to leave evidence of Blackwood's involvement, a clue she hoped someone would eventually discover after her accusations were dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken, unstable woman. The documentary concludes at Whitewater Lake, the scene of the original picnic and Elizabeth's disappearance. The camera captures the peaceful setting as Emily walks along the shore. The same view visible in the 1915 photograph, now overlaid with the modern landscape. The trees are larger, the shoreline slightly altered by a century of natural processes, but the location remains recognizable, a serene setting that once witnessed a family's destruction. Theodore Blackwood was never found, the narrator explains, as historical footage shows passenger ships departing American ports in 1917. Immigration and passport records suggest he may have fled to Europe shortly before America's entry into World War I, possibly traveling under an assumed name. The chaos of wartime Europe would have made it relatively easy for someone to establish a new identity, effectively vanishing from documented history. The fates of the abducted children, including Elizabeth Thornton, apparently renamed Eliza Blackwood, remain only partially resolved. The girl identified as Eliza disappeared from school records after 1922, leaving no trace in marriage, death, or census documents under either name. If she survived into adulthood, she would have been in her late 90s when Emily began her investigation. We've identified descendants of 2 other missing girls from different towns, Emily explains, displaying a family tree she has painstakingly reconstructed. In both cases, DNA testing confirmed these individuals aren't biologically related to the families who lost children, suggesting they were indeed replacements provided by Blackwood. We're still searching for anyone who might be descended from Elizabeth Thornton, but after a century, these connections become increasingly difficult to trace. The camera returns to the Thornton family plot in Oakwood Cemetery, where Emily places flowers at both Elizabeth's memorial and Margaret's grave. Margaret Thornton was dismissed as delusional, but she knew the truth, Emily reflects. She altered that photograph as her final testimony, her way of ensuring that someday someone would understand what really happened. Archives show that Charles Thornton lived until 1931, never remarrying after Margaret's death. Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, the apparent replacement child, married in 1936 and moved to California, maintaining minimal contact with her adoptive family. William and James Thornton both served in World War II and returned to live out their lives in Millfield, neither ever speaking publicly about their lost sister or their mother's decline. In the end, this remains an open case, Emily concludes, holding the photograph that started her investigation. But Margaret Thornton's final act, altering this photograph to leave a clue, has finally brought some measure of truth to light, over a century later. We may never know the full extent of Blackwood's crimes or what became of all his victims, but at least now their stories won't remain buried in forgotten archives. The shadow Margaret added to this photograph has finally served its purpose, to point to the man who was watching from the darkness. The camera focuses one last time on the photograph, zooming in on the shadow behind Elizabeth, the deliberate mark of an observer, a predator hiding in plain sight, and a mother's desperate attempt to identify her daughter's abductor when no one would believe her words. Some shadows from the past, the narrator concludes, refuse to fade away until justice is served, and while complete answers may never come, Elizabeth Thornton is no longer just a forgotten missing child. Her story and her mother's desperate search for truth will now be remembered, a century-old mystery partially solved by a shadow deliberately left behind. The screen fades to black as archival footage shows the Thornton family in happier times. Elizabeth's face clearly visible, smiling at a camera operated by a photographer whose identity remained hidden for over a century, until a shadow revealed his presence.